Jingiwala. My name's Delta K, for those who don't know me, and I belong to the Arakwal people. The Arakwal people belong to the Bundjalung Nation, a nation that we are so proud to call home. On behalf of my people, I want to welcome you to country. Nyalinya, Jugun, Arakwal, Bumblin, Bundjalung, Jugun. Welcome.
Thank you, Delta, and thanks everyone coming out on the chilly night in Federal and not going to a candidates meeting. Welcome to Fed Talks. I think we're up to Fed Talks 9, so we're very happy with that. Our aim is to engage our community in conversations that affect us all, and tonight's topic is a very global one, what it means to be a local. So in a moment, we'll go to that conversation. If you could hold your questions to the end, and if you want to take some lemons or kumquats home with you after that, you can. So I'd like to now welcome our moderator tonight, Annalie Knight, journalist and entrepreneur, to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone to Fed Talks tonight. I'm very excited to introduce our panellists for the topic, what it means to be local. You've already met at Southern Cross University, a senior lecturer in cultural studies, and he did his whole PhD on what it means to be local, or around that topic. And Jessie Cole is a local novelist. I love Jessie's books. I've actually bought about 10 copies and given them to all my friends. And she's also written in The Good Weekend about growing up and still living in the house that she was born in. So we have some wonderful perspectives here. Could you please welcome our three panellists? I'm going to get started and just ask each of our three guests to tell us a bit about themselves and what it means to them to be a local. So Jessie, do you want to get started?
So I grew up and still live in the house that I was born into, in Burringbar, so that's about an hour away from here. And in terms of, I think my parents moved here when I was, well, you know, they moved here just before I was born, but as part of the hippie kind of movement. And so for us, the local term has always been a kind of contested term, I think, because, I mean, in those days, my parents were seen as the new settlers in a town that had been relatively it hadn't had much influx of new people, I don't think, or for some time. And so my early years at primary school and stuff, there was a very big divide between the hippie kids and the local. We would call them the local kids, like we weren't the local kids. We were the newcomers. So it's an odd position in a sense, because I've been here that whole time and I've had my own children into the same house. And the locals themselves were almost all from farming families that had been in my town for a really long time, and they were, or it felt to me that they were all vaguely related genetically also. So everyone was, you know, distant cousins or whatever, and so it didn't even just feel like you were. I felt that I wasn't just. Yeah, it was a divide between the newcomers and a huge family. It felt to us, and the local families were really involved, really participated in the school running of the school and the sporting and the sort of community events. So I think that for my parents, it was hard to get a foot in a lot of those sort of institutions, or that they always felt like they were on the outside when they were doing that. And there were all sorts of kind of cultural clashes around food and, you know, like, you know, the hippie parents trying to get healthier food at the community preschools. And that my mum always tells this story about a dad that rang up and said, "I don't see what the difference is between an apple and an ice vovo." So there's this kind of quite huge cultural divide. And yeah, so nowadays I think I feel like I have quite a conflictual relationship with the idea of being local or not being local because of that in a sense, I felt like I grew up as part of an immigration, in a sense, and yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? At the school that your sons went to, how did the dynamic change from when you were at school?
I think it was really different because there'd been so much transient population, but I still, my first son did start at the old primary school, so yeah, that maybe it was, it's hard to know those sort of things, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you. I might ask later what your sons think about being local, but we can come back to that as well, the generations. And how about you, Rob? How did you come to be doing your PhD on this topic?
Okay, well, I grew up, I'm from Lismore. So I grew up in Lismore, in East Lismore to be more precise, and both my parents were born in Lismore, but their parents before that had come here from elsewhere. So I guess one of the things that's common there, I think, is about migration in, you know. So I grew up thinking of myself as a local, and that wasn't just about Lismore itself, that also extended itself to Lennox Head, where I spent a lot of time with my school friends. And so I thought about myself as a local at Lennox as well, which was sort of a, extension of that. And so I grew up here in Lismore, and in the same house for the first 18 years of my life, and then I moved to Sydney and was in Sydney for 20 years, and then I moved back to Lismore. And it was at that point which being local became not something that I just took for granted, but became a problem, because coming back was then the place had changed, all the people around that I used to connect with had changed, and I was a different person, and so I started to become intensely interested in this idea about being local. And in fact, what I thought was that if I did a project on it, and so I chose to do a PhD on the idea of being a local. Sort of PhDs do, you do some research and you go, oh shit, okay, well, it's much more complicated than that. So so I guess that's how I came to do the PhD, and especially one of the things that really piqued my interest in this was that at the same time as being a local was a problem for me, there was all these instances of the use of the word local, being a local in the Northern Star. And so I think, well, this is really all these instances of the use of the word local, being a local in the Northern Star. And so that, I think, wow, this is really interesting. All these, if you like, appeal to most of the flyers that are sort of fluttering about for local elections. You'll see the word local used in all sorts of different ways to sort of give some justification for why it is that I should be a candidate or what we stand for and those sorts of things. So so that was my story, I guess.
We'll come back to that, that Northern Star part of your research as well. That sounds really interesting. Thank you, Rob. Delta.
Okay, I grew up at the Belongil, and my whole life I grew up around the Shire, Brunswick Heads, the Belongil, then we'd go over to Mullen, back to the Belongil, down to Suffolk Park. So usually wherever we could have somewhere to stay with us 6 wild black kids, as Mum would call us. So growing up at the Belongil, yeah, it was a workers' suburb of Byron, where all the workers lived, because everyone that I grew up with was fishing families. The place stunk because of the meatworks, and so no one wanted to live down at the Belongil. It was stinky, and there was just houses with all these nets hanging, fishing nets hanging, and all us kids would just play amongst the fishing nets and then have a swim in the Belongil or go over to the beach. I always just felt like, we just belonged there. I felt safe, and everyone knew each other. Everyone knew each other. And if we had no food in the cupboard, you know, we'd just go down the beach and dig up some buckets of pippies all before school, and we'd take them down the corner shop, where's now the big petrol station at the Blondel to school. So Byron was such a small town where we all knew each other. We all knew our neighbours. My older brothers and sisters used to just hitch everywhere because they'd stand on the side of the road and, you know, someone always picked them up that you knew. And as we moved around the Shire, that was always the case. Being an Aboriginal, well, I didn't realise was so different. You know, going home and you know, finding mud crabs just crawling all over your kitchen floor after your father's been fishing all night was just a normality for us, you know, fish flipping in the sink and prawns. And we had a really private upbringing, so I never brought my non-Aboriginal friends home. Mum, yeah, just grew us up really private like that. But as I got older, we moved to Suffolk Park Caravan Park. That's where all the hippies lived. That was great. You know, no one went without. You know, we all shared the food. If someone was broke, they'd come over and we'd give them food, or we'd go over there and borrow some sugar. So it was a very small and caring community out Suffolk Park, Caravan Park. And again, just living from the land, always having fresh produce. And then I went to Mullumbimby High School, and Mum started allowing me to visit my friends after school. And that's when I found out I was different, hey, because they didn't have crabs running around their floors or fish constantly everywhere, or they had chops and roasts and yeah, so I went home and I demanded that Mum feed us properly, like with other kids. Yeah, so when you're taking a fish sandwich at school and you start looking around and the other kids have got Vegemite, yeah, I was really, really jealous. Then I started realising we're different. The word local gets thrown around a lot, and for me personally, I don't like the way it's being used now. I think it's quite divisive in our community. When I finished Mullumbimby High School, I went to Melbourne. I meant to go down there to do a one-year childcare course because I knew I wanted to work with children. So I went to Melbourne, and Melbourne opened my eyes. All these Aboriginal people from all over Australia went to Melbourne for work. And it had, down there's this really strong Aboriginal identity. You know, growing up here, the only Aboriginal family, we kept really quiet. We didn't talk about being black. But down Melbourne, they were marching in the streets, hundreds of Aboriginal people, and they were wearing the Aboriginal flag. When I wore that Aboriginal flag to Mullumbimby High School, all the teachers said, "What is that?" And I said, "It's the Aboriginal flag." They just couldn't understand, what is it? But down Melbourne, everyone's wearing these flags and they're doing the, you know, the Black Panther thing. And so it really taught me about identity, and it really changed my outlook. All my friends were, you know, Muslims and Greeks, and I had a wonderful array of friends down there that I worked in the childcare industry. And Archie and Ruby Roach were really close with my birth mother, Nancy, and so they spent a lot of time with her in the park. And Ruby was, you know, sisters, you know, with Mum, because Mum was the one who introduced Archie when he walked into the wonderful characters that we met. And she said, with all these other people around the table, "Oh, we know your sister, we'll take you to him." So, you know what I mean? So all these wonderful characters that we met in Melbourne really strengthened the way I felt. And then one day I woke up after, you know, building a house with my husband, a Gunditjmara warrior man. We built a house, and, you know, we've got 7 kids, and I just woke up one day and I said, "I've got to go home." are you going to come or are you staying? So we sold the house, we took the young kids and the older kids stayed, because we're Brady Bunch, they stayed with their other half. And I felt strong in here, and I felt strong in here. And I don't know, personally I didn't use that term, oh, I'm a local. I mean, you do now because it gets thrown around a lot. But I just used to say, yeah, I'm from here. I was born and bred here. I grew up here, you know, just simple. And today, because I felt welcome down Melbourne and everyone, you know, just simple. And today, because I felt welcome down Melbourne and everyone was community-minded, I suppose. Doesn't matter what colour you was. When I come home, I was very, the fact that these people are bringing up all these fresh ideas. It's really difficult when you're sitting there with people in the Shire who've lived there all their life and they don't want change. They don't want these new people coming up here with their fresh ideas. I think it's very divisive. As locals, we need to embrace all these new people and get rid of the word local, you know. If you feel like you belong, doing this with someone makes us get rid of the word local, you know. If you feel like you belong, doing this with someone makes us belong. We care. That's what's being a local. Looking after each other, never isolating someone.
Thank you, Delta.
I'm going to stop looking after each other, never isolating someone.
Thank you, Delta.
I'm going to stop because I just keep going on and on.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, that's-
sorry you fellas out there.
That idea of the word local being divisive, I think, is really interesting. And I was just mentioning before, when I've been living here 5 years now, and I certainly wouldn't call myself a local, although I do feel like this area is home. But I was on the TEDx Byron Bay committee in the first year that I was here, and we invited someone along to come and speak to our committee who might get involved in the project. And that person introduced him or herself as, they said their name, and then they said, and I'm a 5th generation Byron Bay local. That was the second thing, and exclusion that felt like it was being communicated in that statement. So maybe this is a good time to talk about the Northern Star and, well, who is not a local? How is that conveyed perhaps through the media in this area?
Okay. I mean, it's such an interesting thing. There's a historian in this area, some of you might know, Dr. Jo Kygis, and Jo did her thesis on, it was called Moving to the Coast, and so she, I mean, it was actually about the defence of Look at Me Now headland down at, where's that? Near Coff somewhere, and as part of her thesis, she looked at the use of local over time, and one of the things that she talks about in that is the successive waves of migration and how those ones, the ones for the real locals, and then there's sort of some, I guess, around the turn of the century, but then there's a huge sort of change in migration after World War II. And that sort of wave came along, and so they're not the locals they're not locals, but the previous lot were locals. And you know, then we've got 1970s, and there's a whole group of new that dress, what they eat, all that sort of thing. I can't remember what the question is now, but so you know, there's all this interesting use of the term, and it's sort of a generational thing that goes on and on and on and on as a way of sort of saying, well, we claim the right to speak for this place in some way. And I can understand that, because I think one of the things you mentioned, Del, that then sort of gets us caught up in not wanting it to change, but wanting it to stay the same.
Or who gets to make decisions over the way it changes.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
And so, and that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you could think about, you know, what comes to mind there is the Terania Creek blockade, and a whole lot of blow-ins who really have new ideas, you
Yeah.
know. Byron Bay
You
Marine
can imagine my
Park.
mother, she was disgusted. She's going, gee, these white people walking around with no clothes on. Us black fellas
Exactly.
told us to put our clothes on.
Exactly. I mean, you can tell the locals, can't you? So, so look, just coming back to the question. One of the things about being a local is that local produce, exactly, local produce. Here's another example where we can start to get caught up in a little bit of inclusion and exclusion stuff. And so, but if you change it into a noun, so take that adjective, local person, and then talk about the locals, so suddenly this adjective becomes a noun. Being a noun, there's a whole lot of other stuff that gets left behind. So who is the person? Who is the local? And so part of my research was to have a look at the Northern Star, and this was a sort of like a 18-month period, 2003 to 2005 or so, looking at the use of the word local in the Northern Star. Every time the local was mentioned, what's their place, what are they identifying against? So thinking about what's excluded from this idea of local. Byron Bay is a great place for locals because there's such a flux, you know. So around this time there was the Byron Bay Marine Park stuff happening. There was the whole thing about New Year's Eve and, you know, young revellers coming in and upsetting the locals. All manner of things going on. The whole thing about New Year's Eve and, you know, young revellers coming in and upsetting the locals. All manner of things going on there.
Native title, taking
Native
away the
title.
locals' backyard.
I reckon, yeah. You know, like we looked after the beach. We've been fishing here for years looking after this place. And then people like you come along and tell us we can't do it anymore.
I know, they went and formed a group. Let's save the goats. They're taking the goats off the lighthouse.
Yeah. So it's amazing. So one of the story there, but I won't go into that, that in the Northern Star at this time, the locals are always, you know, there's another story there, but I won't go into that, that in the Northern Star at this time, the locals are always white, Aborigines were never locals. And so that was one of the dividing lines that you could see very clearly. If Aborigines were locals, they were also always adjective locals. The only time they were locals was if they were at Wadja, you know, somewhere in the Northern Territory. So it was sort of like there's settled parts of the continent and unsettled parts, and it's all right for Aborigines to be locals there, but not on the southeastern coast. So that was one of the dividing lines about who is and who wasn't a local. And remember, this is in the Northern Star, so they're also speaking to a particular readership. And so, you know, there's a whole lot of things going on there about who will be included in the idea of being a local, because you want your readers to feel like they belong in some way. So that's sort of some of what I did about who is and who isn't a local. And look, I just in one anecdote, you know, just mentioned that you can quickly see what a malleable thing it is. If someone came up to you at the service station and you're filling your car and they said, "Are you a local?" because I want to go to, I don't know, the Federal Hall, then you might say, "Oh yeah, you just go up there." But if you're at the meeting to organise your event, are you a local? Well, actually, I'm a fifth generation local. I'm a real local. So it has this malleable quality as well. So there's a whole range of things that we could, you know, come into it.
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
All three of you have mentioned the word home, and I think it's really interesting that divide between the word local, and I guess that's an external statement, I'm a local, and then that feeling of home. So you sort of talk about where home is and coming home, and I guess if being local was a feeling, I mean, I think what you said, Delta, about connection and community is such a generous and a warm way to talk about this term. And the question I guess I have is, if being local is a feeling, then how would you describe that feeling? So I might ask you,
I would
Jessie.
describe it the same way you did, as belonging. That would definitely be the feeling for me. But I always think as well that the word local, I mean, I don't even identify as local even though I've been in the same house my entire life, but that's because I identify local specifically with this other crew and not me. You know, that's just that word. But I identify obviously deeply with a sense of home, and the home being here. But I also think that even being a local is somewhat conditional on your behaviour. So you can be born into a community and then you don't play by that community's rules, or someone in your family doesn't, or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're sort of on the outer. So I don't feel like I mean, I've watched that growing up and, you know, never leaving, that kind of. I mean, and both of my novels actually have, the protagonist is a kind of insider, outsider. That's how I would explain them. So they've always been in the town, but they're somehow still an outsider. So for me, it's a very sort of, you're never going to be able to say I'm a local and I'm a local forever, because it kind of has all these conditions attached to around acceptance and around. Being, I suppose, playing your part in the way that is expected. Yeah.
Do you think that's something that's unique to this area?
That's a very hard question for me to answer. I think
You only know this
I
area.
know this area. Yeah. Yes.
I could jump in there because I mean, what you've just given, Jessie, is a really interesting outline of. So, just in terms of this whole idea of local, and is that for those of us who sort of have some sort of European heritage, or we claim some European heritage, there's this kinship system that comes from England and sort of Britain more widely, but England in particular, and it's sort of become a Western kinship system called, and you probably heard of this idea, born and bred. So it's called a born and bred kinship system. And the idea of the born and bred kinship system is that we attach ourselves to places, so our places are very important to our way of belonging if we're part of this kinship system. And there's a number of ways in which we come to do this. One is the born thing, so it's about who was born here and where we're born. And so often when people talk about home, and you ask them, oh, where do you come from? There might be this sort of stammer of behaviour for a second. Do you mean now or before, where I was born, you know? And so there's that sort of, okay, I was born there, that's sort of the born part. And the bred part is that way of fitting in, you know? So this idea that, you know, that places infuse us with a certain way of being, you know? So you get that way of being when you come to Baring, or should I mention the word? Baring Bar. Yeah. And the locals behave differently. It's really different. You know, fitting in amongst the locals is different. And so you can become part of, you can actually be sort of incorporated into this whole way of belonging through the fitting in process.
And I also wonder whether feeling like a local requires quite a degree of participation in community. So if you don't participate, then it's hard to be included. Yeah.
True. Well, don't look at me. Being Aboriginal, we are who we are. So part of etiquette is, you know, when people say, "Oh, where you're from," you know, you tell them, "Oh, I'm okay from Byron Bay." Aboriginal people, that's what we do. First thing we say is, oh, where you from, brother, sister? And yeah, oh, my mother's from here, and my father's from there. So yeah, it's just the way we are. So we don't need to say, oh, I'm local. Yeah,
What were you
our
saying
culture.
before about Melbourne? Just that they were much more welcoming to bring people into that sense of being local and part of the community. Is that
Because everyone is going there for work, there is such a strong sense of community because, yeah, everyone doesn't belong there. But there's a warrior in every Aboriginal person, so if you overstep your boundary, you're going to be told you don't belong here. That's for sure. And that still happens today with Aboriginal people. That's that behaviour you're talking about, you know. It's really important you have that behaviour, otherwise people will let you know that you're not from here and to pull your head in.
Did you feel that, just with Rob's research about local, not including Aboriginal people, have you felt that in reading local media before?
Growing up here, I always saw the non-Aboriginal population be respectful to my family. You know, we were fisher family. My parents worked hard. They were labourers, whatever odd job they could get around town. But then native title come along. In 1996, the last kids of Jimmy and Linda Kay put a native title application in, the four sisters. And that's where a lot of people were saying, yeah, I'm fifth generation or whatever. And they were frightened of the term native title. So we found that people wanted to prove how long they'd been there. So whenever we tried to do anything with working with national parks, like removing the feral goats from the headland to protect the headland and the environment, the first thing the locals did was create a Save the Goat group, because we were changing things. But I didn't grow up with that divide of being Aboriginal. We're in a community. But yeah, native title sort of changed that, and our people got a voice. We started rocking the boat.
And that created a sense of otherness as well. Or?
Yeah. So that was quite difficult to watch, to go to community meetings, because my elders really wanted to sit down and talk with council and talk with groups and bring them along that native title journey to actually explain that, no, we're not going to take your backyard. It's not like that at all. We needed our community on board, and by spending time with our community, they slowly understood what native title was about, and about the elders' vision of protecting country and revitalising our culture. So having that voice through white man's law, yeah, that really upset the locals, the real locals who were also born at Byron Bay, yeah.
I guess one of the things I noticed in my research was how the word local often comes up when there's a threat, you know, of some type from the outside. And, you know, we can see, I guess, instances of that at the moment. Brexit, you know, so there's this sort of a global thing happening, this global threat to our nation state. And so we'll have Brexit, we'll leave the European Union because we want to decide who will come here and who won't be allowed in, you know, that sort of idea. I guess Trump is also often playing on that idea of the threat of the global and the outsiders having some say over our place and how things happen. So we're in a time where I guess the local and the global are always sort of interconnected, or the outside and that inside are always interconnected, And so,
And also,
Yeah.
there's so much movement. I mean, apart from me,
yes.
it feels like the entire rest of the world is moving all the time. So, like, connection to one place, I think, is more and more rare in a sense. So, I mean, I suppose that is it's a confusing time, isn't it? If I mean, how uncoupled maybe in a sense place and the concept of local becomes if populations are so transient. I mean, I heard a statistic a little while back about Australia saying Australia was one of the most transient, you know, like people's move really, it's seen as a really acceptable thing to do, to move states and all that sort of stuff a lot. So, you know, I suppose all those kind of, how do we define ourselves as belonging if we're in a constant state of moving or, you know, starting again somewhere else? Or I think those things are really interesting questions.
Jesse, I was going to ask you, you know, you were talking about local being the pioneering families. When you were growing up, what relationship or sense did you have from the Aboriginal people in the area?
I didn't feel like, in my primary school there was no Aboriginal kids. We had one girl who was Torres Strait Island, or I don't even know what island, but she was an islander girl, and so I felt like it was very, very absent. But I did have this interesting feeling because a lot of the hippie kids grew up in very connected to the landscape because they were allowed to roam free and, you know, no clothes and no shoes and that sort of stuff. So I had this sense as a little girl that we had books like the Rainbow Serpent and that sort of stuff, and I had this idea as a child that if I was Aboriginal, then my connectedness to my home place would be valid, and that it wasn't valid because I was white. So, but it was a feeling that I was kind of deeply, not embarrassed about, but ambivalent about. I didn't know how to explain it to anybody, and I thought it was kind of, it was almost another instance of feeling like I wasn't included, or I was on the outside of something that I desperately wanted to be on the inside of, because it's the Aboriginal culture that minuscule amounts, like just books and things, so very minimal contact with Aboriginal culture, but I ascertained that it was about connection to place and connection to country, which was really important to me as a little girl. And many, many years later, I had this conversation with my girlfriends who had all grown up the same way as me about having had this feeling, and everyone said, I know, that's exactly how I felt. And so I kind of thought that it was an interesting thing, like we'd all had this weird secret feeling that if we were really Indigenous, then we would, then the way that we felt about our homes would be acceptable or real or something that was meaningful, whereas we had to try and make sense of that with no cultural help, or, you know. And actually in one of my novels, the protagonist has a very intense connection to her home place, but she has no story or no religion or no spiritual explanation for this. So it's almost like it's this invented, very... it doesn't have any history for her, but it's still really strong. So it's just something I'm really interested in, yeah. But I have no knowledge of actual Indigenous culture, yeah.
I want to ask all of you about what are some life events, perhaps, that can make you feel more local? And just hearing you talk, Jessie, do you think writing 2 novels set in this area even is part of that extending, you know, a public sort of statement of belonging?
I think it's really interesting because when my first novel was published, no one in my town noticed or commented or read it or anything. It was just like it didn't happen, and I didn't know, like, because it was in the local papers and stuff, so I was like, is someone gonna like talk to me about it at some stage? And after about, seriously, yeah, I don't know if they read the paper, I have no idea. Anyway, after about 18 months, people started to, like, because I used to walk my dog on the road, and people started to slow down their car and wind down their window and say, I read your book. and I'd just look at them and they'd go, it was, what did they say? They'd say, you got it right. And that's all they'd say. And then they'd just wind the window back up and keep driving.
That's
Yeah,
great.
you got it right. So... And I also had this woman ride up on horseback, and she said, "One day I'm going to write a book about you." and then she, and I said, and I was at a disadvantage because I was on the ground and she was on a horse, and I said, "Why don't you?" Yeah. So I think the books, I don't feel like the books made anyone else feel like I was more local. In fact, the opposite, because I think the protagonists are these insider-outsider characters. So, and in a sense, critiquing the notion of small-town community. So I feel that my community is quite tight-lipped about the depiction, apart from the occasional yelling out the car window incident. Yeah.
How about that feeling for yourself? Is that sort of staking your claim in writing about that area?
I think so, and I also think that my family has had a difficult relationship with our town. We've had some, some traumatic instances which in a sense made my whole family kind of out on the outer of the community. And so I do think writing the books is a way of me saying, I'm still here. I'm still here in this town, and you can see me, or like I was making myself visible in a way that I think that I wasn't, and my whole family as well. So, but it's an uncomfortable place because I think it's an uncomfortable place to have to stand up and say, "See me, I'm here." I don't think that's very comforting for anyone really. So, yeah, I don't know about that. But I notice when I leave, I get definitely very defined as a local from here, that's the way everybody else sees me, yeah.
So to more, I guess writing a book is one way. Maybe we were talking about even certain life events. I know for me, marrying Dylan, whose mum's family has been here for a long time, and his 3 uncles all live in the area between Evans Head and Newry Bar. And that makes me feel, I feel more grounded here, and I have lived in lots of different places.
You're one of the mob now.
And I would never state that, but it's just, for me, it's a feeling of being grounded because I've lived in lots of different places. My mother's actually Finnish, and when I go to Finland, they will often talk to me on Finnair. They'll start talking to me in Finnish, and I love that feeling of, I've been in Russia and people have come up to me and talked to me in Finnish, and I feel really Finnish, but I can't speak the language, very well.
You're identifiable.
But I feel very, very at home there. It's that it's a strange feeling. I know I'll always be on the outside without the language in such a tight knit culture. So I guess for me, moving around and having family all over the world, it's so grounding for me to marry into a family that's been here for a really long time. What other kind of events or moments, is it having children here? Or
I just want to share a story just at the Byron Bay Writers Festival. You read Mullumbimby, Melissa Lukashenko's book? Has anyone read Mullumbimby? Yeah. Melissa would bump into me every now and again and she goes, "Have you read the book?" I go, no. And then I realised, okay, I'm going to be on this panel with Melissa. And I went to my girlfriend's house up on the Mullum Hills there, Bronwyn Kid, and I said, "Bronnie, can I lend that Mullumbimby book?" She goes, yeah. I said, I've got to read it before I see Melissa. Because she looks scared. Have you read it yet? So I rock up for our panel and I said, "Melissa, I've read Mullumbimby." And she's like, "Yeah?" And I went, "I loved it. It is so muggle and cheeky." And her face was just like, her whole body just went, like.
Well, I think there's something about that Mullumbimby book that's so cheeky because she uses so many real local people and she doesn't change their names or anything. And it's like, I thought it was an incredible act of saying, not like fuck you, but it was kind of a bit like that. It was like, you guys have come here and taken everything and now I'm going to use all your names and you can all just... she had I can't remember, but the guy that runs the service, and you're like, that's his actual name. And, I thought it was so cheeky and so awesome.
Cool. I kept rattling off all my family members. Oh, that was this person, this person.
I mean, she made no attempt whatsoever to shield anyone. I just loved it.
And then she tells me, she goes, oh, someone said I should do a film, but I'm not going to do it, Delta. I'm not going to do it. I went, that's a great idea. So she went, really? Yeah. No, let's be inclusive. That's fantastic.
So, Rob, you had some ideas on events.
Well, I guess what I was thinking about was the final, I'll talk about this PhD, it's all I've got to talk about. The final chapter of my PhD was called Ethics of Location, which was a term which my supervisor, Baden Offord, who I'm sure some of you will know here, said, oh, I think that's what you're writing about, or that's where you're going to. And so that's where I started thinking about this ethics of location, because what I was interested in my PhD was white stuff. Like what's on this side of the fence that's about possession, how we possessed this place enough to clear the land and install ourselves as locals. Like, how has that happened, you know? It's even in our language, it's in the structure of our language. And so there has to be some ethics of locating ourselves. And I read the book by Deborah Bird Rose. It's called Reports from a Wild Country, an Ethics for Decolonisation. And one of the things I took out of that book was it's about doing stuff with other people. So, you know, sort of that thing about doing and being part of a
participating,
community
yeah.
and connecting with others. And I thought, okay, at some stage, this is going to mean get out from behind the white picket fence and go and do some stuff, and ideally with some Aboriginal people, but I didn't know how to do that. Anyway, so I'm coming to this, I didn't know any.
Now you know me.
I know you. So there's one. So, you know, which is great, you know, so you can do, so now I can start to do something. And so, look, one of the things that happened for me that's been really interesting is that I think that for us white fellas, and I'm talking about fellas in particular, but it probably extends further than that, there's something about being able to reimagine our place and start to reimagine it and chuck away a whole lot of other stuff that we've brought here to actually see where we are, to be sort of earthbound here, you know. And
I just wanted to say that we have this thing where in my little town where new people come in, new farmers in particular come in, and they poison everything on the land before they start again.
right, yeah.
And it reminds me a little bit of that. So it's like the whole thing, and then they'll start, and it feels like a massive ownership
Clearing.
thing. Like, I will raise this place to nothing, and then I will build it up, and it will be my empire.
Yeah.
And it's just still happening. Like that's
Wow.
just happened in the last couple of years in my neighbourhood.
Yeah,
Reminds
it
me a
is
little bit of
amazing,
that.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And so how do you rebuild from that? And I guess for me, there was this project in Lismore, they're doing a play, is it Three Brothers, is that right? And they had these two young Aboriginal guys in town with a couch. And so you sit on the couch, and they're going to interview you. What's it like to live on Bundjalung country? And I didn't get that experience, but I saw this little film that they made of all these people being interviewed, and I thought, oh shit, imagine someone asking me, what does it feel like to be on Bundjalung land? I thought, I have no idea. Actually, I'm usually walking on concrete, I'm walking in Lismore, I'm walking down the street past the shops, I'm driving about, so high off the ground. I'm not even in contact with Bundjalung land, and so what has been really wonderful for me in terms of something I've done is working with a group from North Lismore, from Banyan Begum, we did a sign project at the showground to recognise the Indigenous, sorry, I have to say Aboriginal because they'd shoot me if I said Indigenous. Not shoot me, but
Sorry, I probably said it wrong the whole way through.
No, that's okay. And through that process of writing these signs together, of being on country, of having a second pair of eyes, I guess it's that has been something that has really helped me start to feel, okay, I don't know much, but I'm starting to know a little bit more about this place. And so that's something, so like I was saying before, like I think you've used the word a lot, Delta, and you too, Jesse, about connection, and I think it's that connection, and it's a connection out, you know, that has been really meaningful for me in terms of, it wasn't doing research on what does it mean to be a local that helped me become a local or feel local. It was actually working with others on a meaningful project, you know, of recognising place, or I don't know, it could be anything. But working.
It's interesting that as little girls that we felt that we were on Bundjalung land, even if we didn't know that word, we felt there was something missing from our experience. But it's like, because we were actually on the land, you know, like we were in the creeks and we were barefoot and we were, you know what I mean? Like it's
connection to the land, connection to country, and it's all to do with stories. You know,
but we didn't have any of the stories, so we felt like that was really missing.
You made your stories with your friends. You connected with country, and by doing this project, these are all stories. That's how I'm connected to country, from hundreds and thousands of years of story. So today we all tell our stories, and we all feel connected. We all feel that belonging because we care.
Can I ask you a question then?
Yep.
So one of the other things we've talked about in that connection is this sort of inside-outside thing, and about that boundary and exclusion. So I'm wondering about, how do we make ourselves sort of feel like we belong without that sort of possessive belonging, you know, this belongs to me, belonging, as opposed to we belong here? I don't know whether that's a fair question to ask, but...
It feels like contribution is a big part of what you're talking about. It's connection, but it's also contribution and participation, which Jessie was talking about. But
definitely. When people move here, we want them to contribute. We want them to pick up a piece of paper if they're walking down the street or down the beach. We want their business to support our children's sporting events. So that's how we make all these newcomers feel welcome. And we're breaking down those barriers. And I mean, times are different now. I grew up quite sheltered in my culture where we didn't share it. Now I'm running education programs every day with kids or adults, and I'm constantly sharing my culture, because I want these people to belong and respect and value my country and my culture.
thanks, Delta. I'm going to hand over to you now, the audience. And normally at these kind of events, we say, please ask a short question, not share a story. But we're going to flip it over this time, because I'm sure a lot of you have stories to share. As Delta said, stories are such a big part of it. So maybe just a short story, so a few different people can share their stories. But if anyone would like to, you can ask a question, but also if any of you would like to share your experience of what it means to be local. Was there a moment where you really felt more local than before? Or, you know, what does it mean to you to be local? So is this the microphone? That's okay. Anyone want to contribute?
Thanks. Thank you, all of you, for these warm and generous reflections on being local. I think it was you, Annalie, who said, "Is this a Byron thing?" And I remember when I was living in South Gippsland, and a sign was put up by locals at the top surf beach, where people who weren't locals had been coming to surf. And it said, "If you don't live here, don't surf here." And that was, to me, you know, that exactly what you said, Delta, about that it didn't use the word local, but that's what it was about. And I thought, that is horrible. That's really exclusive in a very negative way. But I actually wanted to talk about something that what you've all been talking about made me think about, which is not to do with local here, but actually local somewhere else that I've spent a lot of time, which is in Bali. And I don't know if people who've been to Bali have noticed that Balinese, you know, if they're driving you somewhere or you're having interaction with them, they will very often ask, where are you from? And I wondered, why do people always ask this question? And mostly I would just answer very blandly about Australia. And then I realised, hanging out with a Balinese gal that I'd become very close with, and I can speak reasonably good Indonesian, but I can't speak Balinese, which of course is what the Balinese speak to each other. It's quite a difficult language to understand. But the moment that she met someone she hadn't met before, no matter how fleeting the interaction, I would hear this question and answer and response. And the word Klungkung was always in there. Now, I knew Klungkung was the village that she was from. And I realised they're always asking her, where are you from? And she would tell them she was from Klungkung. And they'd go, oh, you're always here. Oh, Klungkung. And then there would be more conversation. And it placed her. It put her in place. Like what you were saying, Delta, about, you know, where are you from, sister? That's what they were asking.
But I feel like maybe that becomes quite a contested question in Australia, because it's like people think, especially if there's different ethnicities and stuff involved, and it's like you say, where are you from? And then the person thinks, do you mean what suburb did I grow up in, or what is my ancestry? Or so it's like that question often gets avoided because it's complex for people and they don't know how to manage it.
So much more complex, yeah. Absolutely. But I think that it has its roots in the growing up, you know, I mean, people, there's always been migration, but people were mostly more used to a situation where there was, you know, more longer term stability, not so much moving around in the way Australians do, so mobile. But the way that Balinese become local to wherever they've moved to, whether through marriage or migration within Bali, is by joining the Banjar, which is the village group that does work. That's how you become local. You work together. You contribute. And that, yeah. I'm so struck by what you're saying about that's what makes that sense of connection.
But it's tricky, I think, when you feel ostracised in your own community. It's tricky to participate, because I think about that a lot in terms of my family, because my mum in particular is quite a hermit-like mode of, and in fact I think lots of small country towns, or especially ones way out like mine, at the back of where I live, which is Upper Burring Bar, which is in the middle of the back reaches. I mean, it's almost like a percentage of the population out there are hermits and hardly leave their houses. I mean, maybe that's why they're there, but there's a part of me that wonders, is the chicken or egg, like how, like if you've already sort of been semi-shunned or you feel like an outsider, then how do you join it's just a tricky little equation, I think.
Personally, I like to push the question, where you're from, because I want to make a connection with that person, so I would ask you, only because I want to connect with you. So if you're going to talk about Burring Bar, I'll go, oh yeah, I've got a girlfriend who lives up there too. Or if you're going to say, oh, I'm from Sydney and then I moved to Burring Bar.
Yeah, I always ask it too, but sometimes especially when I go into cities, I don't know whether it's the right thing to do, because there's such a different degree of diversity, and and I often just don't know if that's what the done thing is or not. No, but I always do it here.
You just go with your gut feeling.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast today with Maxine Beneba Clark, and she said, it was from one of the Writers' Festivals, but she said that she was first asked that question, where are you from, when she was in primary school, and she was like, oh, from my parents. She'd never thought about that. And then it was like, well, what country, and she said, oh, well, we came, my parents came over from England. And she said it was, she said, oh, no one was going to say, why, you're brown. And, she just said her teacher thought she was being belligerent in being slow to answer that question, but it's something that she'd never come to before. So I'd love to hear from someone in the audience who is from another country outside Australia, who is a local here and feels like this is home, about that experience, because I think that is a different experience as well. Richard?
I'm going to give it to you, Richard, but I've got the mic, so I'm going to do it first. I'm from Wainuiomata, which is in New Zealand, and I was born there, and but I've lived in Goonangeri for the longest part of my longest time of anywhere in my life, and I immensely feel from there, in the sense I work in the dirt most days, and I feel like that's connected me to it, but I'm scared that I'll never leave if I say I'm from there, you know, and I always want to go other places and things, you know. So that I find that interesting with the born and bred thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Richard Arnott. I grew up in Central Africa, travelled all over the world, and trained in England and Scotland and so forth. And I visited Australia very briefly for a day in 1966, and then some years later came to Australia for a short working holiday. That was 35 years ago. And within 24 hours, I felt like I'd come home. It was an extraordinary feeling of belonging, having not even been in the country for 24 hours. And that feeling has persisted ever since. And I don't know what it is. I think it's in the nature of the people, perhaps. I think Australians are naturally fairly friendly and welcoming people, as opposed to certainly in England, where it's very hard to get to know people unless you are introduced to them. There's some formal connection. It's really very difficult. Whereas Australia, I find, is a very welcoming place.
Anyone else got a story to share? Susanna?
Thank you, I've loved this talk. I have an interesting definition of local. I don't like the term local, but my definition of home and feeling like I belong here is, and it will sound morbid, but this is where I don't mind if I die. So it's the opposite of living. It's like if that is my last view, if Federal is my last view from my veranda, I would shut my eyes and think, that's fucking great. So my definition is the opposite. But I actually had a question, which was, you've talked about the bad uses of the words local, but for me there's things like buy local, which to me says buy this product or the market because someone else can live here because they're creating a business. So there's a whole lot of ways local is also used in ways that aren't divisive, but I see them, like the buy local one for instance, as being supportive. So when I buy that whatever from the market, I'm supporting that person in their business because that $50 or whatever it is will mean a lot to them. So there's a lot of good uses of the word local, and I have actually been in Sydney for 5 years and have come back. And it's interesting, even in the city, people, that whole local thing, it doesn't matter where you live, that local breeds. And yeah, so I was just interested in how, if there were any other ways you saw local as a positive term, not just negative.
Anyone, do any of you want to answer that?
Something's coming. Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it, that local produce thing. I guess sometimes I still have a bit of a problem with it because I don't know that every place, you know, we've got a really fruitful environment and it's a great place to grow stuff and really good stuff. But if you live somewhere else, I think, you know, that we've always people have tended to trade across the country. And so we do always need other things from other places. So I guess I'm sort of with the local thing, and I do like doing that too. And I, you know, go to the farmers market and all that stuff, and that feels really good. And I think as long as it doesn't become too chauvinistic, I guess that's my concern. You know, whether it sort of becomes some sort of demarcation. You know. because one of the things I guess that we're trying to do there too, I think, is that in terms of belonging, it's sort of like the earth at some stage has said, you're not really belonging very well here. You know, like in terms of the way we do our belonging on the earth, it's sort of spitting us out and saying, well, Lordy, it feels a bit poisonous. So I guess that's part of the local thing as well, and sort of coming to belong in that way. So it's an interesting idea, I think, local food.
I do love the idea of supporting the local economy. Like, we've just moved our banking to Southern Cross Credit Union, and just even going to, it was Helena's local economy conference, and just even looking at even something as simple as doing your banking in the area, how much money that keeps in an area and supports local jobs and supports local abundance, I guess. So I think it's something I'd never thought about beyond here. But I remember when I first got here, I got really into ukulele, and I was going to Brisbane, and I was like, "Oh, go and buy a ukulele." And my friend was like, "No, you've got to buy a ukulele locally." And of course, it was just funny. I just thought you go to the city and you look for those purchases. But of course, I went to Byron Music Store and got my beautiful ukulele. And it's something that I really think about now, because I do travel to the city a bit with my work, and I do think that's something that people are really conscious of here, and it's a fantastic part of community that people are supporting local and conscious of where their food comes from, and
Agree.
supporting.
Agree, and I'm glad you brought that point up.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else?
Sorry, and just before you start, and it's all about manners. It's fine to be saying, yeah, I'm local, because I suppose what I was getting at was that it's those people who are divisive and rude. Being a local at Byron, the Facebook page, a local fella, Wright, the Wright family, who started off the Byron Shire News. And I remember the Byron Shire News was just a little few pieces of paper, and it's quite grown now. So that family started off John Wright started off the Facebook page, What I Miss About Byron Bay. And at the start, this Facebook page was great fun. People were putting things up like, I miss the skating rink, and I miss the penny parlour, and I miss, all this old stuff. Mexican mix, it was great. I had to block the page because people have got no manners on it now. Someone might get on the page and say something, and then you get a real local getting on there saying, well, how long you been here for? That's what gets up my goat, that divisiveness of people having to prove how long they've been here, and just being really rude at people who want to bring a fresh view to the town. So please, your turn.
Thanks, Delta. Mark's my name. Just on that point about local produce, it seems to me that local in that context has a sort of connotation of authenticity, that there's something about human scale as well that goes with local in that sense, which is a good thing. But I come from a part of Australia in suburban Sydney called Little Bay. That's where I grew up, next to La Perouse, which you might know a bit about, Delta. I don't know, but and up the road at the surfing beaches there around Malabar, there was the same sort of graffiti about this is locals only, blow ends keep out, and all that sort of stuff, in huge letters along the sandstone sort of reaches around the bay there. But at La Perouse Primary School, where I went in the 70s, from 72 to 75, I think. A third of the school was true local. Their families had been in the area for a long time, since before white settlement. And as a result, when I played in the rugby league team for the school, I barely touched the ball, and we never lost a game the whole time I was there. And the Ella brothers went to that school, and so did Marcia. But anyway, but since moving here, I've had a sense of community that I never had there. And I had a father who was a school teacher whose, sorry Dad, whose limited education separated him from the community there, because it was a sort of depression community of humpies, and red brick houses were pretty recent. And so Dad, having finished uni, you know, set himself apart, and so we got bungers in our letterbox on cracker night, that kind of thing. And so we were apart, and I've then lived, you know, around the world here and there, and mainly in Sydney, and this is the first time I've experienced living in community and have a strong sense of home from participating in everything that's going around here. And it's beautiful, mainly through the football club, but also through this hall and all the things that happen here. One brief story to get back to the locals in Lapa. Growing up, a bit like what you said about not knowing that you're an Aboriginal person, or however you want to describe it, and we didn't know, you know, who the kids were who were different from us, and it was the League of Nations anyway, with people from all over Europe as well, just in our street. But there was a guy called Brett who came in from Dubbo, and one day at assembly he sat next to me, and I didn't know him, and he was quite different from the local guys, and he said, "Mark, you're a gubber." And that was the first time I'd heard that word, and it's like, I've got a visceral sort of, recollection of what that was like, and being made to feel in that moment different in a way that I've barely ever felt since. And yeah, it's fascinating. I then moved schools soon after and lost touch with Brett. There you go, there's a bit of a rave, but thanks for that.
I think we have time for one more story before we need to wrap it up. So,
Hi. I just wanted to say that I was born in Mullumbimby, and my grandma was born in Burrumba in the early 1900s, and I have an 8-year-old boy who was also born in Mullumbimby, and I have a really strong sense of place and always felt like I belonged, partly because of that. And there's been so much change over this time, and my child is half Brazilian. So his heritage is Italian, Portuguese, native Brazilian, Indian, African, and he sees himself as belonging in the community because part of him is from somewhere else. Because so many people now, like at his school, there's French, Thai, Japanese. So it's really interesting that his sense of belonging is that such a huge part of him is from somewhere else. That's all.
I just wanted to tell a slightly different story about arriving in Goongarrie in the mid-70s, and I can say that the locals that were around at the time, there were only a handful of families there, but they were extremely welcoming, and they were selling us bits of their land and able to buy tractors and things like that, so there was some self-interest involved, but they'd also bring that tractor to the bit they'd sold you and help you out with things and stuff like that. And there wasn't a great deal of sort of community capacity to work together for the community at Goongarrie. There was a school, but the principal was very unpopular, so people would sort of be sending their kids in other places and things, and because I have a bit of a drive to do community work, it's in this place, Federal, that I've done the most of it, and I'm happy to say that it's been a really successful outcome, and people do love to come to Federal. There is an issue though that's emerging now. And it's not about, who's been here the longest or whatever, but it's a little bit hard to really, or maybe it's just me, because I don't mix in the same circles. I haven't got kids at the preschool and things like that, but some of the people who are coming are not really making an effort to make that connection to community. You know, it's hard to motivate people to actually participate in things, isn't it, Al? At some of the time.
Well, I experience both things. There's lots of people fully involved, and there's lots of people operating Airbnb properties from Scotland.
And I think that
And you can't borrow sugar from them.
I think that the cost of living, and especially real estate here, is just, it's. I mean, I notice it because my generation, I suppose, is I have a whole bunch of friends that grew up here, that would like to live here and can't afford to live here, and I don't know what that means. Like, you know, they're cast out from their homeland economically. I mean, I think it's a really big question. So, yeah, I mean, if you feel such a degree of connection to a place but you can't actually get back in, you've gone off to become educated and then you can't get back in. I don't know. I think it's a tricky area too.
Come and live in Lismore.
Yes, I've heard that.
And just,
Or casino.
just to make a comment on yours, getting people motivated, it's the dreaded, you know, changing of life of the internet and all these fancy gadgets. You know, it's keeping people more indoors. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
We've run out of time, sadly. Okay, one more. One more quick story.
Something Mark said before just prompted my memory of the sign. I don't know, probably a lot of people here surf out at Pass. I've been surfing there most of my life, and there's that sign up on the rocks.
Yes.
That says locals only in big white letters. Then a few months later, it'll be changed to love only. A few months later, it'll be changed to locals only. Dichotomy between, you know, the great use of the word locals, of we belong to this place, and it's all about inclusion and cooperative.
Small enough. Oh, no.
And the cooperative nature of community versus this place belongs to me, and this is mine. So there's always that fight between love only and locals only, I suppose. And I was just thinking, you know, like no matter where we go, there's pricks everywhere. It's just yeah, you know, it's just about continually changing the sign back to love only. So I was thinking of that.
I love it. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
So put your hand up. Who feels like a local? Who's a local here? Put your hand up, nice and tall. Everyone's hands should be up. We all belong.
Thank you so much to our three panellists for sharing your stories today, and I really feel like there's so much warmth that's been added to that term local in this conversation tonight. And I'd also like to thank the organisers of Fed Talks, because they go to so much effort to put these events on, and really it is part of connecting all the things we've been talking about tonight, connecting community, contributing, and it's a huge part of all of us being here tonight feeling more local. So thank you so much, Alan, and all of your team for organising tonight.
Thank you very much to you all. And we've heard a lot about PhDs tonight. So that warms us up to our November event, which you'll find out about through the internet, which is all going to be about reimagining education in Australia and the value of how we're doing it and how we might do it better in the future. So that's in November. And I'm just going to end on this one with another thank you. And I'm reading Alexi Sale's autobiography, and it's called Margaret Thatcher Stole My Trousers. And it's very funny. And in the first chapter, it's about when he grows up and he leaves London on the train, leaves Liverpool on the train to go to London. The last image is on the train tunnel as he's leaving, big graffiti, "Fuck off all you Londoners." So, it's the first thing people see on the way in. And he said he's been going backwards and forwards to Liverpool for 45 years since then, and no matter all the millions of dollars on rail crews, cleaning up the platforms, the sign is still there. In fact, every time he goes back, it seems to be done again. So, there too. Thank you. Bye.